Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Friends of Peace Now webinar, the third in our new series. My name is Joshua Cox. I'm a board member of Canadian Friends of Peace Now, and I will be your host this morning. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Daniel Seidemann, a world-renowned expert on conflicts over Jerusalem and how these impact the wider Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Daniel is speaking to us from his home in Israel. He'll be addressing the topic, Jerusalem, Eye of the Coming Storm. As usual, we will start with a presentation from Daniel Seidemann. After that, I will get the Q&A session rolling with a few questions. Then we will go to questions from our audience. Now, I'd like to ask my fellow board member, Jacqueline Schwartz, to introduce our guest. Over to you, Jacqueline.
Thanks, Josh. We had him in Toronto before, and I've also met him in Jerusalem. And when European diplomats and American government advisors, at least in previous administrations, want to understand Jerusalem, they seek out Daniel Seidemann as their go-to guy. He's an internationally acclaimed lawyer and a peace activist. He's the founder and director of Terrestrial Jerusalem, which is an Israeli NGO that raises awareness about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Daniel immigrated to Israel from the US in 1993. He's a retired reserve major in the Israeli Defense Forces and a lawyer. He's represented as such both Israeli and Palestinian residents of Jerusalem before planning boards and has argued more than 20 cases before the Supreme Court. So over to you, Daniel.
These coming weeks and months are going to be among the most fateful in the history of Israel since we've existed. What we've seen in recent years, since Netanyahu came back into power in 2009, was a strategic thrust to take Jerusalem off the table, to turn it and to basically create a unilateral border between Israel and a so-called Palestinian state, which is really autonomy on steroids. Netanyahu didn't support the Jura annexation because he feared, I think correctly, that the Jura annexation would jeopardize de facto annexation. In comes Trump. He moves the embassy, he recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and then he comes out with the Trump plan, which is almost identical to Netanyahu's endgame. Israeli hegemony over all of the West Bank to the east, to the west of the Jordan River, sole Israeli control over Jerusalem, and a fragmented, fractured Palestinian entity, which you can call a state if you're delusional. Netanyahu, in the interim, became more defiant, more imperial. He and Churchill went to the same kindergarten, and also more vulnerable. He's going to trial 1 week from today, and not over small matters. So the combination of being Caesar and being vulnerable creates a dangerous mix. And then as a result of that, all of these factors, annexation was born. Annexation of large parts of the West Bank. We don't know what the map is. Jacqueline, be pleased to hear that I'm in touch with the Trump White House, even though I'm not exactly sure whether I should be proud of that. And the goal of this is to, by the end of the first Trump administration, which we all pray will be the last Trump administration, they want to create a sufficient amount of facts on the ground to create a new normal which will condemn Israel and the Palestinians to a situation of perpetual occupation. That's where we're. I don't think it's a done deal. I think that it is stoppable. It's not going to be easy, but we need to articulate what is at stake. And I will articulate what is at stake in one sentence. Israel will end occupation, or occupation will be the end of us. Questions?
Mm-hmm. So Danny, I mean, are you viewing this as, when we talk about the end of us, we're talking about the Jewish and democratic nature, I assume?
Nadav Pardo was the head of the Israeli Mossad and appointee from Netanyahu. He is not a left winger.
Mm-hmm.
And Nadav Pardo said, and has said a number of times, over time, Israel cannot survive as a perpetually occupying power.
Mm-hmm.
Israel is confronting one existential threat in this generation. It is not the Iranian nuclear capability. It's dangerous. I don't make light of it, but
Mm-hmm.
we have responses to that. It's not 120,000 Hezbollah rockets, which we also have a response to. You can shut us down for a few months. It doesn't endanger our existence. Occupation, perpetual occupation, endangers the very viability of the Third Jewish Commonwealth. And I agree completely with him. And if you will look at combatants for commanders for Israel security,
Right.
90% of Israel's former commanders, Mossad people, Shin Bet people, say the same.
So Daniel, let me ask you a question. If everything that you're describing seems to describe a security challenge, right? It's a security challenge. It's the existence of Israel as we know it. Why does this concern seem to primarily be originating out of the circles of people that one might describe as being the left as opposed to the right? If this was really the truth, why wouldn't the right also see this in a way? Sure, it's one thing to want land, it's one thing to want control over it, but if you understood the consequences of taking it and that would result in your own destruction, why wouldn't those same groups of people see it in that way?
It's a great question. It's, to a certain extent, it's almost like asking why do 40% of the United States continue to support Trump?
Right.
But it's a bit different here. I think that both Israelis and Palestinians have been deeply traumatized by the Second Intifada. And we arrived at the Second Intifada already traumatized by Holocaust displacement on one hand and Nakba on the other hand. Palestinians have no idea how terrified Israelis are of the wave of terror that took place in the Second Intifada. And we Israelis have no idea how humiliated and subjugated the Palestinians are under our occupation. The major challenge to bringing this to the Israeli public is not ideological support of the settlers. Most of Israel doesn't support the settlers.
Mm-hmm.
It's clinical occupation denial. If you don't see occupation, it doesn't exist. People in Tel Aviv and in Herzliya and Haifa don't see it, and they won't look at it. And it is the job of us in Israel. You know, when people ask me, you know, are you left? I've never considered myself left or progressive, whatever. I don't define myself.
Right.
But we need to pierce the armor of clinical denial of people who basically agree with us. Under the surface, people basically agree with us, mm-hmm. and have been convinced that it's not possible.
Mm-hmm. So part of our conversation today was around Jerusalem. Um, we have had some other conversations with other, excellent speakers where we've talked about the incrementalism of annexation, and and you mentioned, increasing the small facts on the ground piece by piece by piece. Do you see becoming annexation to be something that happens in one fall swoop, if it happens, or do you see more incremental changes taking place such that they might be more easily consumed? Do you see more things happening with Jerusalem itself, maybe some outlying areas of Jerusalem getting added on, or do you see this happening in kind of one big motion?
We are living in the age of the unknowable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not we don't know. We can't know. There are just too many moving parts. I tend to think that Netanyahu will go for annexation because Trump wants annexation. He won't waste it now. He'll do it before the elections because his only chance of survival is galvanizing his evangelical base. The same people who drink Clorox support occupation in the United States.
Right.
Putting it delicately.
Right.
The things that before that concern me most are two plans, which in and of themselves would make the possibility of creating a border virtually impossible. One of them is Givat Matos on the southern flank of Jerusalem. It's the most dangerous. It's not the most notorious, it's the most dangerous because the bidding of tenders is going to end on June 22nd, and it will basically seal East Jerusalem from its geographical connection to Bethlehem in the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
It's been considered to be a doomsday settlement. There was a démarche, a protest by 11 EU countries about a week ago, specifically on this, not only on annexation, on this. And the second one is E1. Mm-hmm. E1 is immediately to the east of Jerusalem, and it would contain tens of thousands of settler units, and it would fracture any future Palestinian entity into an archipelago of the northern West Bank of Ramallah and Nablus and a southern West Bank of Bethlehem and Hebron. Mm-hmm. It would make the creation of any kind of viable Palestinian state impossible. Those are happening now, right. And they are separate issues from annexation. They are annexation in motion.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something, and I'd like to delve into that a little bit, and that's some of the very relatively recent actions by the EU, because Israel may go and do whatever it does, okay, and it's possible that the international community doesn't really have ability to do much. That very well may happen.
The international community doesn't have the will to do much. It has the ability.
Right. So recently, we did see some things where the EU foreign policy chief made some comments around Israel acting unilaterally. We saw, somewhere between 6 and 8 EU countries saying that they would not allow Israel to, participate in certain policies or upcoming projects if they went ahead with a unilateral annexation. Do you see any of that actually happening, where EU countries are going to step up and do something? Even if they did, would you see that as having any impact on any decisions that Israel would make?
Tough question to answer, because the EU and its member states bark well, they bite less well.
Right.
But having said that, this is not a routine situation. I am fairly confident you will not get any kind of action out of the EU as the EU, because Netanyahu has an absurd block in the EU.
Yep.
Hungary will not let any action that will be less enlightened and democratic than their own governance.
Mm-hmm.
But the member states are engaging. I'm not speculating.
Mm-hmm.
Whether this will have a bite or not, I tend to think there's a chance that it will.
Right.
But
So,
I
yeah.
thought that best. Pay attention to Jordan. Because the Jordanians are telling us, the king is telling us, you will jeopardize the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel if you annex.
Right.
And our security establishment is warning Netanyahu, don't do it. And Jordan is probably the weakest and more vulnerable player that one can imagine. But on this issue, they set the tone. And as Jordan goes, so does the Arab League go, and so does the rest of Europe go. So, and they are beginning to step up in ways we haven't seen in the past.
And so is Jordan a party that Gantz or Netanyahu or anybody around them is willing to consider?
Is willing to?
Consider the actions of?
I think yes. I
Yeah.
think there's no alternative. You know, the stability of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is a strategic interest of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are those in the ideological right, and they're not small, who want Jordan to fall.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it would serve their Jordan is Palestine ideology.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, I think even Netanyahu understands that having a secure and safe eastern border is a strategic asset for Israel, and it depends very much on the stability of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And that is clearly a position of our military, our intelligence community, etc.
Great. Hi, I'd like to ask a question. You talk about Jordan. What about Egypt? And also, what about the Trump administration? Do we have any allies there?
I can give you his phone number. Look, I did not dwell on Jordan accidentally. Because Jordan, as weak as it is the interpreter of things East Jerusalem and West Bank to the Arab world. And that's the role that they fulfilled during the question of recognition and the move of the embassy. If Jordan maintains this position, Egypt will have no choice to follow. When I discussed this a while back with one of my friends who is rather senior in the Egyptian government, he said, "Are you kidding? We already have one Sadat. We don't want another one. Abandoning Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Palestinians will turn Sisi into another Sadat." Trump administration, look, there are nuances, but they're not huge. David Friedman, the ambassador in Tel Aviv, is all about making the damage he's inflicting irreversible, because he kind of suspects that Trump is not going to be a two-term president, unless he refuses to leave office, which is a possibility. Kushner has the same ideology, but is different in nuance. He is interested in neutralizing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the extent that Sunni states will join in a ground alliance against Iran. And he needs the optics of forward movement. But it's going to come down to Trump. Trump has lost the economy. He's in the midst of a horrendous crisis of biblical proportions, and his base wants red meat, and annexation is red meat. So if I had to bet, and this is only a bet, it would be Trump will tell Netanyahu annex probably September, October, so it will be for his maximum electoral benefit. But that's a guess, only a guess.
Well, okay. We have some questions regarding equal rights. And this kind of goes back to something around the Jewish and democratic character. Recently, the European Union adjusted their policy framework to include some language around equal rights for citizens and equal rights of Palestinians and Israelis. And there's some open question around whether or not that was prescient in looking forward to a potential annexation. So should annexation happen, we might see the European Union start pressing for the establishment of equal rights within Israel. And this would now include, hundreds of thousands, if not more, Palestinians. What are your thoughts on that, and whether or not that would have any impact on either annexation taking place or Israeli behavior following annexation?
It's a great question. The facts on the ground are really dire in their implications. We're going to have to relocate 180,000 settlers out of 650,000 in order to create a border. That's very daunting. And people make very compelling arguments that the two-state solution is dead. Mm-hmm. Now, it may be, it may not be, but I can tell you the only expertise I have relates to occupation. If your occupation breaks down, bring it to my garage. I can fix it. I know where to oil the joints. I know where to, where the spark plugs go. And the only way that occupation ends in a border. Now, it's possible to destroy that option. And that has been the goal of Netanyahu. There is no such thing as a one-state solution. There's a one-state consequence. Saying that there's a one-state solution is basically tantamount to saying Israelis and Palestinians hate each other so much they cannot possibly divorce, so they're going to have a successful marriage instead. The logic of that escapes me. Now, there is a lot of two-state agnosticism around, and I understand it. I see the same things. I see more than what most see. But it doesn't create an alternative. Until now, those who remain engaged in Europe and in the Arab world continue to support two states, mm-hmm. in spite of all of the daunting challenges. And they're holding on for dear life, but there's no serious consideration of equal rights as an alternative.
We have a question from John Allen, and he's asked.
Hey, John.
Yeah. So John has asked us around any potential changes of a Biden administration. So if Trump does actually lose this election and Biden takes over the presidency, what does that impact? What are Biden's decisions going to be, and how will Netanyahu and Gantz change behavior or alter anything based on what Biden chooses to do?
Well, a great question, John, as usual. Biden loves Israel. Biden loves an Israel that no longer exists. Biden's love of Israel was born before occupation congealed, okay? His natural instincts will be support Israel right or wrong, which is kind of APAC. Having said that, Netanyahu has gone probably a bridge too far, and the Democratic Party has changed. There's a sea change.
Mm-hmm.
Young Democrats, and most prominent among them, most young Jewish Democrats, are not willing to countenance giving the past to Israel an occupation and turning a blind eye to it. It's generational. I'll give you one small bit of encouragement is Biden took on Bernie Sanders' Mideast advisor, foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss. It doesn't guarantee anything. To a certain extent, I would put it this way. Biden now, in terms of rejecting annexation uncategorically, is probably a dilemma of who he counts most, his donors or the grassroots who will get him elected.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? We'll see.
Okay. Let's talk about the Palestinians. So we've chatted about the EU, we've chatted about the United States, we've chatted about Jordan. What should we expect as a Palestinian reaction right now? Like, what are we seeing right now? Maybe you could comment on that. And then potentially, what might we see if annexation actually takes place?
I am a very small expert, not an expert at all, on the politics of Palestine and Palestinian political culture. I would just hesitantly say the following. This will not go without a response. It could lead to a collapse of the PA, which is on thin ice, regardless. It could lead to a suspension of security cooperation, which would be devastating to Israel. Israelis do not appreciate how many lives have been solved by Palestinian security forces. It could lead to the Palestinians, in Hebrew we say, putting the keys on the table, saying, okay, rule us directly, occupy us. We're no longer going to be your subcontractors for occupation. The mildest response, which I think will get a lot of attention, is recognition of Palestine as a state. And I think that if Israel annexes, you'll see a number of European countries and the most consequential European countries recognizing Palestinian statehood in the 1967 borders.
Wow. Okay. So why don't we pivot here and chat a little bit about some of your experiences, your legal experiences regarding the city of Jerusalem, if that's okay with you. We'll kind of do just a little pivot here. So over the years, obviously there's been some wins and some losses. Would you be able to tell our audience here a little bit about some of the victories that you may have achieved, and kind of how that actually comes about?
Well, I have to be blunt with you. The losses far outweigh the victories. And that's because nations do not deal, nations' courts do not deal with the most radioactive issues in their society. So, the United States Supreme Court never ruled on the legality of the Vietnam War, even though there were compelling reasons why it was illegal. And even today, Guantanamo is maintained without the US Supreme Court weighing in, and Jerusalem is one of those radioactive issues. So when I would arrive at the Supreme Court, the justices would do everything possible not to deal with my substantive claims. And I didn't file cases that were baseless. They had strong arguments. And there were cases, had they been dealing with Netanyahus or Tel Aviv, et cetera, it would have been a slam dunk. And the subtext that I received from the justices of the Supreme Court was, Seidemann, you're going to get a lot of tea and sympathy from us, but you're not going to get judicial release. Take it to the politicians. Mm-hmm. There were a number of occasions when Netanyahu, a week before the elections in 1999, tried to shut down the PLO headquarters in East Jerusalem, Orient House. Mm-hmm. For electoral purposes, I got an injunction stopping him. I saved a number of Palestinian homes from mm-hmm. being taken over by the settlers on false pretenses. My 10-year-old suit, there's a shortfall of 2,000 classrooms in Jerusalem, which means that kids in East Jerusalem don't get a free public school education. I was able to use, and the Supreme Court worked with me on this. They were on my side, but they wouldn't rule in favor of me to work on my side, but to get 400 or 500 classrooms built. Wasn't huge, but it was something.
Absolutely.
Denying a kid an education should be a capital crime. But at the end, I don't go to court anymore, right? Because I know that this is a conflict that will not be solved in a court of law. It will be solved politically, and I am trying to have an impact on the geopolitical decision-making regarding Jerusalem.
So you've made a pivot from more tactical to the higher level strategic play. I guess at this point, we've touched on a couple different elements of this, Daniel, regarding kind of civil rights of the Palestinians. You just commented on how certain individuals can be experiencing not having the entire set of rights that their counterpart does, because they have a different ethnicity. So some of this has already taken place around Jerusalem and other settlements. We have a question from Barbara Landau, and she wanted to ask, what do you see as the future of civil rights, in possible future negotiations, expropriations, denial of citizenship to Palestinians? What about the role of the JNF in, selling Palestinian property settlers in East Jerusalem? What happens if annexation goes ahead? Do we just see the same things that are taking place at a much greater scale? Do you see anything actually shifting?
There are half a dozen wise questions in that. Mm-hmm. So I will try to bring them together. Civil rights in this context is a problematic term. The Palestinian citizens of Israel in Haifa, in Jaffa, in Wadi Ara, the Bedouin, want their fair share of Israeli society in a way that's compatible with their national identities. And that is civil rights. And actually they're making progress, and they have an incredibly capable political leadership at the moment. We're jealous. may well be that Ayman Uda will be the leader of the Israeli left, Jewish and Arab, within a few short months. The Palestinians of East Jerusalem and the West Bank don't want equal rights. They want to rule themselves. And self-determination and civil rights are both ways of achieving dignity, but they are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
And the Palestinians of East Jerusalem don't want to be ruled by us, fairly or unfairly. They just want rid of us, and I understand that. Now, the question on JNF, when I heard it, struck me as bizarre. Why is he a JNF here? And then the nickel dropped. Of course it's relevant. It's a great question. Because the JNF acts as if it's a national liberation movement taking lands away from the enemy and appropriating it to Israeli control. That's what they're doing in Seidemann. That's what they're doing. And they don't recognize the state of Israel. They're not Zionists. They act as if we're in the 1930s Yishuv.
Mm-hmm.
They don't recognize the fact that we have a government that owes fiduciary duties to all of its citizens, Jew and Palestinian Arab. Let's leave it at that for a moment.
Okay. We have a question, another question from the audience around joining with the Arab Joint List to work together to oppose annexation or other groups within Israel. To what extent will any supporting Israeli public join with the Arab communities?
One of the few positive and exhilarating developments in recent months has been with the Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Okay.
Part of it has to do with their political leadership, which is great. Part of it has to do with the fact that a large portion of those who are saving Israeli lives in the COVID-19 crisis are Palestinian citizens of Israel. They're saving us. And it's changing opinions, including my own. I think, and by the way, I think the leadership of the Arab list has made a strategic pivot in the direction of integrating into Israel in a way that does not require one to abandon one's national identity. And they're doing a masterful job of it. Now, it's not a magic bullet. You know, Israeli society is deeply scarred. We have all sorts of reasons to be deeply scarred. It's going to take time to rebuild. But on the eve of the elections, I, my wife, and my daughters had long discussions. Do we vote for the Arab list or do we not? Mm-hmm. In the end, we didn't. And in the aftermath, given the fact that we voted for people who have brought Netanyahu to power, mm-hmm. we have. There?
Oh, yep.
Okay.
No, I think we just cut out for a moment. I think we're still here. So, can you still hear me, Daniel?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, excellent. We have another question from our audience around Netanyahu's trial. So, if he's convicted, what does that do to anything? What does that change?
Look, under current circumstances, legally at least,
Mm-hmm.
He will need to resign only after his conviction
Mm-hmm.
is sustained by the Israeli Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's building on, and he's building on court packing and whatever. It's very difficult to predict how the trial will unfold and have an impact. But it's clear that we are in very dangerous and uncharted waters.
Mm-hmm.
The government that will be sworn in over the next few hours or tomorrow will resemble a democracy. It won't be a democracy.
Would you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
We have a government that is headed by a prime minister under indictment for very serious crimes, that is hell-bent on destroying an independent judiciary, an independent prosecution, an independent press, in order to remain in power. And he is so far succeeding. I think at the end he won't, but it's not going to be easy, and it doesn't come without a price.
Mm-hmm.
But Netanyahu has pivoted Israel internationally into the authoritarian directions of Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte and Orban in Hungary. Domestically, there are proto-fascist manifestations of the way he is governing, and it's not going to get better.
Mm-hmm. And do you view these? I mean, obviously, what is a normal, especially with coronavirus? What's normal? What's new normal? A time is going to come at some point in the future where Israel's government has different leaders. And that might not be 6 months from now. That might be many, many years from now. When that actually does manifest, do you view that changes you're describing will have become so permanent that they have become unchangeable, or do you think that some of these things would be more easily brought back to what would be normal?
Why did you have to ask that?
Well, that's why we have you on, Dan. You're the expert, right? You have.
What would happen if you were able to convince me that the two-state solution was dead as a doornail?
Mm-hmm.
I would get up the next morning and try to bring it back to life, because there's no alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Occupation of the border. And when that border goes up, it can unravel. There can be all sorts of possibilities, including one state. But occupation ends in a border. Do you know how Harold Stassen is?
Mm-hmm.
Harold Stassen was an American politician in the 1940s who ran for president, was very prominent, ended up being, I think, a vice presidential candidate. And he kept on running for president for 20 years. And each time he got 50% of what he got the last time. And he ended up getting running for president, getting 3,000 votes. I will be the Harold Stassen of the two-state solution. Okay?
Right. Good.
Now, we are, the tragedy of contemporary Zionism is that we are confronting the chasm between the politically impossible of engaging the Palestinians and arriving at agreement, and the historically inevitable. And the historically inevitable is two states. We will arrive at two states, or we will not be, because there's no alternative to it. And I doubt that I will live to see it. But I consider my role is to narrow the gap between the politically impossible and the historically inevitable, and to die trying.
We have a great question here from Carol from our audience, who's just asked about the attack on the judiciary. You can answer the question about the judiciary itself, but is there anything that is severe enough that if it takes place, wakes up the rest of Israeli society for them to go out and show a voter base reaction that Netanyahu actually responds to?
You know, I'm a pathological tweeter.
Okay.
And one of the last tweets that I saw is, we've got a government that is completely fucked up on, telling the public what to do in the COVID-19 pandemic. There are 1 million unemployed. Corruption is rampant. There isn't, half of the ministers are under criminal investigation or indictment. And Israelis are out on the street. What will it take?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, look, I really believe in the fundamental decency of the Israeli public, and I will add the Palestinian public. We are much better and much more worthy than our purported leaders. I don't know.
Okay. Fair enough. I know I appreciate the response. So, we're getting up to the end of our time here today. Why don't we talk a little bit about moving forward? There's you as an individual. We have these big blocks like the EU or the United States. There's us here in Canada. Obviously, we have other communities around the world. Do you have any words of wisdom or guidance that you could pass on to the community who may be sitting on this call today around actions that individuals might take, whether it's talking to their local representatives in government? What kind of things might you recommend to the broader community about how to move forward?
I want to give a specifically Canadian answer. Okay. There are 2 radioactive issues in this conflict that sort of scare the shit out of people.
Okay.
One is refugees and the other is Jerusalem. And the finest work that has been done on both of these issues was sponsored by the government of Canada. There was a working group on refugees. I know when negotiations were going on with Secretary of State Kerry, they called in Canadians to advise them. And then there was the wonderful Jerusalem Old City Initiative led by the late and beloved Michael Bell. Canada always punched above its weight. That didn't quite work the way we wanted it to during Harper. And when Harper, came, when we got Trudeau, there were indications. I mean, I met with one of the senior members of your government shortly after Trudeau's assumption of office, and I grinned from ear to ear, and I said, "Welcome back." Well, it didn't quite work out that way because you found yourself with a monster on your southern border, which kind of consumed all of the available attention span.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to tell you that Canada, your representative in Ramallah, your ambassador in Tel Aviv, are 2 of the finest diplomats I've ever met. I am sure they are giving excellent advice to the government of Canada. You need to give them breathing space. You need to expose what's at stake here. The viability of the Zionist enterprise is at stake here. don't leave it to Nabrith or whatever. There are really good people in positions of authority in the Canadian government. Empower them, and believe me, it can have a great deal of significance. I know it's not easy, but it's certainly worth the effort. There are things to be done in Canada that will help us on the ground here.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate the response, as well as the response with the Canadian lens. I actually, sorry, can I just confirm you can still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. I saw a little frozen image. So I think with the time today, maybe we'll wrap it up. And I just want to say I really appreciate your time today. I also want to I want to say we agree with you. You know, we here at Canadian Friends of Peace Now, we're trying to do our utmost to connect with our foreign policy team under Minister Champagne here in Canada, as well as other members of Parliament. We in fact actually sent a letter to him in conjunction with other Jewish organizations here in Canada, expressing our opinions around how we view potential annexation, and that Canada needs to have a role. And so I'm very much glad that we're on the same page on that. So I just want to say thank you again to you, and thank you very much to Jacqueline Schwartz, our other board member, who participated today with that great introduction. And I also want to say thank you to our audience today, who listened in and provided some really wonderful commentary and questions in the Q&A area, as well as some of the questions we got in advance of the session. And then on top of that, I also want to say thank you very much for bearing with the technical challenges that we've experienced today. You know, there's always, you can always expect challenges when you try to do these things live. So I just want to say thank you again for having the patience to bear with that, and to, maybe not have video, or, with how we started late today. So yeah, I guess I'll just wrap with that. Any last words, Daniel?
I want to thank you, and to apologize for all those who sent questions via chat and I didn't respond to, but like most men, I don't multitask.
So actually, with that, thank you very much for bringing that up, because we will capture, for everyone who asked a question that did not get directly answered, or we didn't get, maybe we only answered part of that question, we'll collect those answers, and we'll try to connect afterwards to reach out to you with some of those. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your time, and have a wonderful weekend.